This is my true story. I gave my whole life to my son, thinking love and sacrifice would mean something when I grew old. But instead of respect, I was met with cruelty. One evening, my own son looked me in the eye and told me, "You're not family, you're just a burden for me." His words cut deeper than any knife. In that moment, I realized the bond of blood had been broken. But what he didn't know was that I still held the key to his future. Before I tell you what I did, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. I spent my life working with my hands through storms, sweat, and long nights that seemed endless. Every coin I earned was not for me but for my son. When he was a child, I walked miles to work so he could ride to school with polished shoes on his feet. I skipped meals so he would never go hungry. I worked in factories, on construction sites, in fields where the sun burned my skin, and I told myself it was worth it because one day my son would stand taller than I ever could. When school fees came, I paid them in full. When debts piled on his shoulders in his early years, I cleared them without hesitation. I sold my land once just to keep his future intact. I gave him more than education. I gave him comfort. I gave him shelter. I gave him the security I never had when I was young. The house he lives in, the car he drives, the very clothes on his back were bought by the sacrifices of my body, my time, my dreams. Even when he failed, I carried him. When his first business collapsed, I dipped into my savings to save him from ruin. When he stood at the altar on his wedding day, every smile his friends and family saw came from the money I poured into that moment. The flowers, the music, the home he moved into afterward. It was all built on the foundation of my sacrifice. I thought these things would bind us together forever. I thought a father's giving would grow into a son's gratitude. I believed with all my heart that when I grew old and weak, when my hands could no longer build and my back could no longer carry, he would be there to honor me, to care for me, to sit with me in the quiet of the evening and say, "You are not alone." But what I did not know was that all my giving had not built love in him. It had built entitlement. He saw my sacrifices not as love, but as duty, not as gifts, but as obligations. Every dollar I spent, every debt I cleared, every comfort I gave him only convinced him that he deserved more and owed nothing in return. And as I grew older, instead of giving me respect, he gave me distance. Instead of kindness, he gave me silence. Instead of love, he gave me the cold truth that in his eyes, I was nothing more than a burden. I remember nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, telling myself maybe he was tired, maybe he was stressed, maybe he would change. I excused the sharpness in his voice, the coldness in his eyes, because I did not want to believe that my sacrifices had raised a man who would one day look at his father and see only weight. But the truth was there, building like a shadow I refused to face. And so, the years of sacrifice, the decades of labor, the countless moments when I put his needs above mine, all of it came to rest like chains around my chest the day he called me a burden. The cruelty did not come all at once. It came quietly, like a slow poison seeping into the walls of my own home. At first, it was the way he spoke to me. His voice no longer carried warmth, no longer had the respect a son shows to his father. His words were sharp, his tone impatient, as if every time I opened my mouth, I was stealing something from him. His time, his space, his peace. He began to sigh when I asked simple questions, roll his eyes when I repeated myself, look at me not with love, but with annoyance. I remember the first time he snapped at me for sitting in the living room chair. He stood over me, arms crossed, and told me I was always in the way. That chair, the one I had bought with money from years of backbreaking work, suddenly felt like a throne I no longer deserved. I moved to the corner quietly, ashamed, even though I had done nothing wrong. That was when I realized the balance in my own house had shifted. Then came the mocking. My hands, once strong enough to lift beams and build homes, now trembled when I tried to hold a glass. Instead of helping me, he laughed. He called me weak. He called me dead weight, as if the years I carried him in my arms had vanished from his memory. When I dropped a plate one evening, The sound of glass shattering filled the kitchen. I bent down slowly, my knees aching, my back stiff, trying to clean up the mess. He stood there, watching, and instead of helping, he muttered, "Pathetic." That word stayed with me all night, ringing louder than the silence around me. The cruelty grew bolder. He stopped speaking to me unless it was to command or complain. If I asked for a glass of water, he groaned as if the request was too heavy. If I asked about his day, he ignored me completely. Sometimes, when I tried to tell him stories of the past, stories of sacrifice, stories of his childhood, he would cut me off, saying, "No one cares." Those 3 words stabbed deeper than any knife. No one cares. Even his wife joined in the silence. She never raised her voice, but she smirked when he mocked me, looked away when I struggled, pretended I did not exist. My presence in their home, the very home I paid for, became something to laugh at. I was a stranger under my own roof. I told myself it was stress, that maybe he was struggling in ways I could not see, that his cruelty was a mask for his pain. But deep down, I knew better. His cruelty was not born of stress, it was born of pride. He had grown into a man who saw me not as a father, but as an obstacle, not as the foundation of his life, but as a shadow standing in his way. And so I endured in silence. I held my tongue when his words cut deep. I walked slower, quieter, smaller, hoping if I took up less space, his anger would fade. But cruelty, once it finds a home, only grows. The more I endured, the more he gave. And with each passing day, the son I raised with love slipped further away, replaced by a man who looked at me as if I was nothing at all. It was an evening I will never forget because the words spoken that night carved themselves into me deeper than any rope or knife ever could. I was sitting quietly at the table, eating slowly, my hands trembling as I lifted each spoonful. I had grown used to the silence around me, the cold stares, the sighs of irritation whenever I was near. But that night, the silence cracked. My son came home with anger in his eyes, the kind of anger that looks for someone to fall upon. I greeted him softly, hoping to ease his mood, but instead of answering, he slammed his hand on the table. The sound shook the room, and my heart sank. He stared at me with eyes I did not recognize, eyes that once sparkled with innocence when I carried him as a boy, now filled with scorn. "Why are you even here?" he shouted, his voice cutting through me like fire. "This is my house. You just sit here, taking space, wasting air. You're not family. You're just a burden for me." Those words froze me where I sat. My chest tightened, my breath caught, and for a moment I thought my heart had stopped. I had prepared myself for many things in old age, for sickness, for weakness, even for death, but never for this. Never for my own child to erase me with words. To say I was not family, to cast me out of the very bond that had given my life meaning. It was worse than 1,000 deaths. I looked at him, hoping to see regret in his eyes, hoping to see that maybe he had spoken in anger and would take it back. But there was no regret, only hatred. And worse, when I turned my head, I saw his wife standing there, her lips curling into a smirk, as though my humiliation was nothing more than entertainment to her. My pain was her amusement, my suffering their shared joke. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to remind him of everything I had given, everything I had sacrificed, but the words would not come. My throat tightened, my voice locked away by sorrow. I sat there, silent, staring into the face of the boy I once raised, the boy I once believed would carry my legacy, now spitting on it as if it were filth. The spoon slipped from my hand, clattering against the plate, but no one moved to pick it up. They only stood there, watching me, as if daring me to cry. In that moment, I felt smaller than I had ever felt before. Smaller than when I was a child with nothing. Smaller than when I worked my first job with blistered hands. Smaller even than when age had bent my back. Because this was not just weakness of the body. This was the breaking of the soul. My son's words echoed in my head again and again. "You're not family. You're just a burden." Each repetition felt like another stone added to my chest, crushing me deeper into silence. I sat frozen long after he left the room, my food cold on the table, my heart colder still. I thought of all the nights I had gone hungry so he could eat, all the mornings I had walked barefoot so he could have shoes, all the years I had spent carrying him in my arms, only to grow old and hear him call me a burden. I thought of the nights I stayed awake by his sick bed, whispering promises that he would never be alone. And yet here he was, telling me I was nothing to him. The cruelty of that night did not come from fists or ropes. It came from words. Words that cannot be untied, cannot be undone, cannot be erased. Words that marked the end of everything I believed a family was supposed to be. After that night, I sat in silence heavier than stone. The words, "You're not family, you're just a burden," replayed in my head until they were louder than the ticking of the clock, louder than the creaking of the house, louder than my own thoughts. I sat there at the table long after my son had left, staring at the cold plate in front of me, my hands resting uselessly on the wood, trembling not from age, but from the weight of what had just been spoken. My chest felt hollow, as if something sacred had been ripped out and thrown away. I could not eat. I could not cry. I could only sit and let the silence consume me. That silence was not peace. It was humiliation. It was the sound of my pride breaking, the sound of my sacrifices turning to ash. I thought of the nights when I skipped meals so my boy would never go hungry, when I sat with an empty stomach but a full heart because he was eating well. I thought of the times I patched my shoes again and again so I could buy him new ones. I thought of the winters I endured in a thin coat so he could walk warmly to school. And now, all of that love, all of that giving, all of those choices to put him first, had chained me to a reality where my own son saw me not as a father, not even as family, but as a burden. The humiliation deepened when I remembered the day of his wedding. I stood with pride, watching him promise to love and protect another life, believing that somewhere in his vows was still a piece of the boy I raised. I paid for every detail of that day, every flower, every meal, every smile his guests enjoyed. And yet, the man who smiled that day, the man who looked so proud in front of others, was the same man who now spat in my face and told me I was worthless. That memory burned me more than fire ever could. As I sat in the quiet of the night, I felt the house mocking me. The walls I built with my sweat seemed to whisper back his words, "Burden, burden, burden." I tried to shake them off, but they clung to me. I closed my eyes, but even in the darkness I could see his face, twisted in scorn. My humiliation was not just in his words. It was in knowing how much I had given, how much I had sacrificed, and how little it meant to him. Hours passed, yet I did not move. My body grew stiff, but my mind kept moving backward, through the years. I remembered holding him when he was sick, rocking him to sleep when fevers shook his small body. I remembered carrying him on my shoulders at fairs so he could see above the crowd. I remembered working double shifts so he would never know the fear of poverty I once felt. And as I remembered, the humiliation deepened, because I realized that what I saw as love, he saw as weakness. The silence of that night turned into a mirror, showing me the truth I had refused to face. My love had not made him grateful, it had made him cruel. My sacrifices had not taught him respect. They had taught him to take and take until nothing was left of me. I had chained myself with my own devotion, and now those chains rattled louder than the words he spoke. I was humiliated not only by his cruelty, but by the knowledge that I had built the very man who now broke me. Still, in that silence, I did not cry. I did not scream. I sat with my humiliation, heavy as it was, because deep inside another feeling began to stir. Something colder, sharper, more dangerous than sorrow. My son believed that night his words had ended me. He thought by calling me a burden, by stripping me of the name family, he had broken the last piece of dignity I carried. But in his arrogance, he forgot something important. He forgot that age may weaken the body, but it does not erase power. He forgot that the man sitting quietly at his table was still the man who had built the foundation of his entire life. He forgot that the father he mocked still held the keys to the wealth he bragged about. Because what he never cared to remember was that all his fortune, All his stability, all his comforts were built on the back of my sacrifices. The bank accounts he boasted of, the cards he swiped, the businesses he flaunted, all of them were tied to my name, my money, my years of labor. He could insult me with words, but he could not erase the fact that I was the one who opened the doors he walked through. He thought calling me a burden would reduce me to nothing, but the truth was simple. I was still the master of his financial lifeline. I looked around the house he claimed as his, the house I had bought, the land I had signed over for him. Every wall, every chair, every brick carried my fingerprints. Even the accounts he believed were his alone had roots in mine. When he called me a burden, I almost laughed through the pain, because the man who mocked me did not even realize that his pride, his power, his arrogance still depended on me. In that silence, as I replayed his words, I began to see the cracks in his confidence. He had power only because I allowed him to have it. The money that gave him status still flowed from accounts I once controlled. The safety net beneath him still stretched from my years of saving. Without me, he was nothing more than a man with debts and arrogance. I realized then that the rope he thought he had tied around my dignity was actually tied around his future. He had handed me the weapon of his downfall without even knowing it. He believed that words could destroy me, but money was the battlefield he had forgotten I still commanded, and money was the one thing he valued most. That thought gave me strength. For the first time since his cruel outburst, I felt my humiliation begin to shift into something else. My heart still ached, but beneath the ache was a quiet fire. He could call me a burden all he wanted, but the truth remained unshaken. The so-called burden still had the power to take everything from him. He believed family no longer tied us. Fine. Let him see then what happens when blood means nothing and money speaks louder. Let him learn what it feels like to lose what he loves most. Not my presence, not my stories, not my care, but his fortune, his pride, his empire. The empire I had built for him with these same trembling hands he mocked. The night after my son spat those words into my face, I could not sleep. I lay awake in the bed that I had paid for, in the house that I had built, and the echo of his cruelty rattled around in my head like a curse I could not shake. You're not family, you're just a burden. Again and again it played, and each time it struck deeper. At first, my heart felt like it had been split in two. The boy I raised, the boy I gave my body and soul for, the boy whose every dream I carried on my shoulders, had erased me with a sentence. I wanted to weep. I wanted to scream. I wanted to vanish from the world and let the weight crush me. But as the hours dragged and the moon crossed the sky, something inside me began to change. The sorrow hardened. The pain froze. The humiliation transformed into something stronger. For the first time in years, I felt clarity. My son believed his words had ended me, but what they had truly done was awaken me. I began to replay every sacrifice I had ever made for him. The mornings I walked to work with empty pockets so he could have lunch money. The nights I came home late, hands blistered, bones aching, but still placed new shoes by his bed so he would never feel the shame of poverty. The debts I erased, the businesses I bailed out, the roof I gave him, the wedding I paid for, the endless stream of money and energy that flowed from my veins into his life. And in return, what had I been given? Silence, mockery, scorn, and now the final blow, being told I was nothing, not even family. The ledger was clear. My side weighed heavy with sacrifices, his side weighed heavy with cruelty, and that imbalance could not remain. As dawn crept through the window, I sat up and stared at the faint lines on my hands that had built everything he owned. My veins still carried the proof of the years I had worked. My fingers still remembered the weight of tools, the ache of labor, the turning of keys in locks I had bought with my money. These same hands he mocked as weak still held the invisible chains to his fortune, and that realization changed everything. I whispered to myself, if he sees me as nothing, then I will show him what nothing feels like. The decision crystallized like ice in my chest. I would not beg for love anymore. I would not sit in silence, hoping for respect that would never come. I would not allow him to stand tall on the back of my sacrifice while crushing me underfoot. If he could strip me of family with words, then I could strip him of wealth with action. He thought money was his crown, his armor, his pride. I would take it all from him, every last cent, and leave him naked in the eyes of the world. I knew the path would not be loud. I was too old for shouting matches, too weary for fights. My revenge would be silent, precise, devastating. He would wake one morning and find the world he built gone in the blink of an eye. He would search for the foundation beneath him and find only emptiness. And when he reached out for me, for the father he spat on, he would find only silence in return. That was the justice I chose. Not fists, not arguments, but the quiet destruction of the very thing he worshipped most, his money. The more I thought of it, the steadier I became. My humiliation turned into resolve, my resolve into fire. Each cruel laugh, each mocking word, each sigh of irritation he had thrown at me became fuel. I told myself I had one final duty as a father, not to love him, not to protect him, but to teach him the lesson he had refused to learn his whole life, the lesson of consequence, the lesson that cruelty has a cost. By the time the sun rose, my plan was clear. I would drain his bank accounts, every one of them, using the access I still had because he had been careless enough to leave me tied into his finances. I would take the $2 million he believed was untouchable, the $2 million he bragged about to friends, the $2 million that gave him the arrogance to spit in my face, and I would make it mine. Not for greed, not for glory, but for justice. He had chained me with his words, and I would chain him with emptiness. When the morning birds began to sing, I rose from my bed not as a broken old man, but as a man reborn in decision. My heart was still scarred, but it beat with purpose. My son thought he had ended me. In truth, he had created me anew. And this new man was no longer silent, no longer humiliated, no longer waiting for kindness that would never come. This new man was ready to strike back, with the only weapon my son respected, money. And so the decision was made. He erased me as family. I would erase his fortune. The morning after my decision, I sat at the desk where I had once balanced bills for the family, the same desk where I taught my son how to write his name when he was a boy, and I prepared to do what he never imagined I could. My hands trembled, but not from fear. They trembled with a kind of power I had not felt in years. On the table lay the records, the accounts, the access codes, all of it left in my reach because my son, arrogant as always, believed I was too old to understand numbers, too weak to touch technology, too foolish to see through him. He had forgotten that I was the one who had set up those accounts in the first place, the one who had funded them, the one who had shaped every dollar that now sat in them. He called me a burden, but he had left the keys to his empire in my hands. I opened the records slowly, my breath steadying as I saw the figures appear. $2 million. That was the sum that defined his pride, the sum he flaunted to neighbors, the sum he waved like a flag of victory at family gatherings. $2 million that made him stand taller, that made him feel untouchable, that gave him the arrogance to call his own father useless. My eyes stayed fixed on that number as if it were his face, and in my chest, I felt no guilt, no hesitation. I only felt justice. With every click, I thought of the years I sacrificed. With every number I typed, I thought of the nights I went without food. With every confirmation screen, I thought of his words replaying in my head. You're not family. You're just a burden. Those words gave me strength when my fingers hesitated. They pushed me forward when doubt tried to whisper. When the system asked for final confirmation, I pressed yes with a steady hand. And in an instant, the empire he built on my back collapsed. $2 million drained from his account, not with noise, not with fury, but with silence, with the quiet finality of a father's revenge. I transferred the funds into accounts under my control, accounts he knew nothing about, accounts I had kept hidden because I knew one day, one way or another, the time might come when I would need them. That day had arrived. The transfer was clean, invisible to him until the moment he checked. The money was no longer his to boast about. It was mine, every cent. and the satisfaction that flooded through me was not wild or loud. It was calm, steady, righteous. I sat back in my chair, the same chair where I once taught him his numbers, and I whispered to myself, "Now who is the burden?" I imagined his face when he would open his account and see the emptiness, the panic that would strike his pride, the frantic calls he would make, first to the bank, then to his friends, then to me. I imagined the silence he would hear in return, the silence I had endured for years. That silence would be my final word to him. The act itself took only minutes, but the weight of it carried the strength of decades. It was not theft. It was not greed. It was repayment for every insult, every humiliation, every moment I sat in silence while he trampled me. It was the final proof that even a man mocked as weak, even a man dismissed as a burden, could still strike with power sharper than any blade. When the last confirmation came through, I closed the records, leaned back, and felt a peace I had not known in years. The rope he tied around my dignity had been cut, not by his hands, but by mine. And in its place, I held the chain around his pride, a chain I pulled tight in a single move. His empire was gone, his fortune vanished, and all that remained was my justice. The money was mine now, safely resting in accounts he could never touch. And with it came not just power, but freedom. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of his cruelty lifting from my shoulders. No longer was I chained to his house, his insults, his cold eyes. I had the means to walk away and never return. That night, while the house slept in silence, I packed my bag. Not a heavy bag, not a suitcase filled with memories, just enough for a man who wanted nothing but escape. A few clothes, my documents, the access to the accounts I now controlled. I left behind the chair he mocked me in, the table where he humiliated me, the walls that had echoed with his words. I left them without regret. I booked my flight quietly, my trembling fingers steady on the keyboard as I typed the destination. Paris. The city of light, the city of freedom, the city where no one knew my name, no one knew my shame, no one saw me as a burden. I imagined myself walking under the Eiffel Tower, drinking coffee in a cafe, sitting by the Seine with my head high, far from the man who tried to break me. Each click that confirmed the booking was like a hammer striking the chains he had bound me with. By the time I printed the ticket, I was no longer his victim. I was a man reborn. When dawn came, I did not wait to see his face. I left before he stirred, slipping quietly into the morning, my bag on my shoulder, my steps light despite my age. The taxi ride to the airport felt like a dream. The city I had once walked with bowed head now rolled past my window as if saluting me on my way out. Every street corner, every light post, every familiar building seemed to whisper, "You are free." At the airport, I moved slowly, but inside I felt faster than ever. My heart beat not with fear, but with excitement. The humiliation of his words still echoed in my memory, but now they fueled me. "You're not family, you're just a burden." Let him wake to that phrase himself when he saw his empty accounts, when he realized the burden had flown with his fortune. The plane took off, and as it rose above the clouds, I looked down one last time. The land I had worked on, the home I had built, the place where I had been humiliated grew smaller and smaller until it vanished into the horizon. I did not cry. I did not look back with longing. I looked forward. Hours later, the plane touched down in Paris. The air was different, rich with life, filled with voices that spoke a language I barely understood but carried music all the same. I walked out of the airport and felt the world open. No one here knew the insult I had endured. No one here saw me as weak. I was just another man, free to live as he pleased. That first morning, I sat at a small cafe near the Eiffel Tower. The waiter brought me coffee, and as I lifted the cup, I felt the warmth not only on my hands, but deep in my chest. Around me, people laughed, walked, talked, and no one looked at me with scorn. I was not a burden here. I was simply a man. The city sparkled in the light, the streets alive with energy, and I breathed it all in like medicine for my soul. My son could keep his cruelty, his arrogance, his empty pride. I had taken what mattered most, and I had used it not for revenge alone, but for freedom. In Paris, I was not his father, not his burden, not his shadow. I was myself. The morning I flew across the sky and landed in Paris was the same morning my son woke to find his empire turned to dust. He rose from his bed with the same arrogance he carried every day, certain the world bent to him, certain his fortune was safe, certain his father was powerless. He poured his coffee, reached for his phone, opened his banking app the way he always did, expecting to see the numbers that made him proud. But this time there was nothing. The balance was gone, wiped clean. $2 million vanished in a single night. At first, he thought it was a mistake, a glitch in the system, something that would fix itself. He refreshed the page again and again, his fingers shaking, but the emptiness stared back at him each time. Panic rose in his chest like fire. His heart raced as he called the bank, demanding answers, shouting into the phone as though volume would change the truth. But the truth stood firm. The money had been transferred, legally, silently, beyond his reach. I was thousands of miles away, sipping coffee under the Eiffel Tower, while he tore through the house in rage, slamming doors, throwing papers, searching for someone to blame. He called my number, his voice surely trembling with anger, but his calls rang into silence. The silence that had once suffocated me was now my weapon against him. He dialed again and again, desperate, but I did not answer. The man who once told me I was nothing now begged for my voice, and I gave him none. The neighbors soon noticed. Word spreads faster than fire when pride falls. The same man who once strutted down the street bragging of his wealth, looking down on others, now stumbled around with a face pale as chalk, whispering about stolen accounts, drained fortunes, betrayal. People began to talk. Did you hear? His father took everything. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others smirked with satisfaction. The man who mocked his own father now became the story whispered on every corner. Relatives called too, not to support him, but to ask if it was true, if the same man who had laughed at me now had nothing left. His arrogance collapsed under the weight of their questions, and for the first time he stood naked in front of the world, stripped not just of money, but of respect. His pride, built on wealth, shattered overnight. He searched for comfort from his wife, but even she looked at him with disappointment, because she too had loved the life the money bought, and now it was gone. His so-called friends turned their backs quickly. They had been drawn to his riches, not his character, and without money, they had no reason to stay. He tried to speak of rebuilding, of bouncing back, but no one believed him. Without me, without my sacrifices, without the silent hand that had always saved him, he was just another man with debts and arrogance. And now he was alone. While he drowned in panic and shame, I walked freely along the streets of Paris. The weight of his words still echoed in my memory, but they no longer hurt me. They fueled me. Every step I took on cobblestone streets was proof that his cruelty no longer bound me. Every sip of coffee, every smile from strangers, every glimpse of the Seine reminded me that I had escaped the prison of his arrogance. He had called me a burden, but now he carried the burden of loss, of humiliation, of an empty future. The roles had reversed. The man who once tied me down with insults was now tied down by his own downfall. That was the fallout. My silence, my decision, my action. It left him powerless, pride broken, world shattered. And it left me free, standing tall in the city of light. Justice did not come to me in the form of a courtroom, nor in the sound of police sirens, nor in the punishment of handcuffs. Justice came quietly, in the rhythm of my footsteps on the streets of Paris, in the taste of warm bread from a bakery at sunrise, in the sight of the Eiffel Tower rising against a sky painted gold. Each moment I lived freely in that city was a victory. Each corner I turned, each smile I received from strangers reminded me that I had reclaimed something my son thought he had taken from me, my dignity. He believed he had buried me with his words, but instead, I buried him with his own arrogance. In Paris, no one saw me as a burden. I was not the old man mocked at a dinner table. I was not the weak father told I was not family. I was simply a man, walking with his head held high, carrying not shame, but freedom. I drank coffee under trees whose leaves whispered with the wind. I stood on bridges above the Seine, watching boats pass beneath. And I thought of all the nights I sat in silence, humiliated, believing I had nothing left. And now, here I was, standing taller than ever, not because my body was strong, but because my spirit was unbroken. Back in his house, my son lived with the weight of his downfall. He woke each day to empty accounts, to neighbors' whispers, to relatives' disappointment. He searched for me in calls I never answered, in words I never returned. He looked for the father he once mocked, the father he once erased, and found only silence. That silence was my final gift to him, a lesson that cruelty comes with a price, that arrogance collapses when the foundation of respect is removed. He thought he had stripped me of family, but in truth, he stripped himself of everything. I walked through Paris streets with a smile he could never erase. I visited museums, sat in gardens, wandered markets filled with colors and life. Every moment was a reminder that the $2 million I took was not just money. It was the weight of my justice, the proof that I was never powerless. That fortune had been built by my sacrifices, and it now served me, not him. It gave me the chance to live my final years in peace, in freedom, in a place where no one mocked me. Some nights, I sat by the window of a small apartment overlooking the city lights, and I thought of him. Not with sorrow, not with longing, but with clarity. He had chosen his path when he looked me in the eyes and told me I was not family. I had chosen mine when I took back what was always mine to give or take. He lived in shame. I lived in freedom. That was justice. And so my story ends not with defeat, but with triumph. He said I was not family, that I was just a burden. But I showed him the truth. I drained his $2 million, left him to his silence, and flew to Paris, where I found peace in streets filled with light. That is my justice, and I carry it with pride until my last breath.